Hi, my name is Lee Gerdes. I'm founder and CEO of Brain State Technologies. The company is all about helping me initially with trauma. Trauma is actually a response from the brain based on the brain's perception, not the reality necessarily, but the brain's perception of the organism being threatened. So let me give you an example. The little girl has to go into her bedroom, and she has a ways to go when she's real little to her bed, and it doesn't have a light switch there. And so every night she goes in and she thinks there's something in her room. She dives under the covers, and then they wake up in the morning and she's in a kind of a fetal position under the covers. Was there something in her room? No. Did she perceive that? Yes. Was it a trauma? Yes. Did it affect her? Yes, it did. For 40 years after that, it affected her. It's not necessarily real. A trauma too is very real. It's a baseball bat, hitting me in the head. Or it's someone who loses their financial well-being in the world. They have to choose bankruptcy, for example. If we want to find the source of trauma, it's not an infinite source if we go back subjectively, but it could be because it's really tough. And so I'm not convinced that subjectively we can necessarily find it. And the reason I don't think we can necessarily is because it's not necessarily one thing, it builds up. For example, I was asked by the Department of Defense years ago to take a look at some soldiers, some who had PTSD and some who did not, but they faced the same situation. They were riding in the same Humvee, for example, when the explosion happened. So why is it that one of those two had PTSD and one of them didn't? Well, my hypothesis from that view of the data was that one had it because he or she had a lot more trauma going into the situation. So that meant their brain was more imbalanced. So if I was going to explain, trauma the best way I can and remember, I'm not a medical person. I do have a lot of work in clinical psychology as a cognitive behavioral therapist and as a theologian, but still, I'm really a geek, so I have to think about the world in my geekhoodness, which for me is more of a physical, mechanical work, and that's why I use a Newton's cradle to describe this. The brain fires, and when one neuron fires on one side, it passes energy through other neurons, and it fires on the other side, and then it goes back and forth. Now, when we look at this in terms of the autonomic nervous system, what we're thinking about here is one side is rest and relax, the other side is, fight and flight. And so that's the two sides you see, and they're in balance. Now, this brain faces a trauma, and it fires a lot more on one side. And now you have an overactivation going on, and it's driven, you can't really see it here, but it's driven more on the side that it started from, because that's where the major energy happens. Now, if I do this and it's a real big trauma, so I use 3 of those balls, pretty soon that whole thing is going to start moving together, left and right, just like that. And now it's way overactivated. And so that's what we see in a very sensitive EEG pattern, is that overactivation. So when we look at a brain pattern, we can see trauma. We don't necessarily know the source of it. We've correlated some of those, certainly. So we have an idea of, for example, we have an idea of when it happened in the lifespan. Was the person really very young, or was it more recent? And the kind of trauma. Did it cause a freeze response, or did it cause a fight or flight response mostly? And that's kind of interesting, but it doesn't tell us exactly what it was. So, as I demonstrated, when everything is overactivated, it's not a matter of letting go. It's a matter of it's there constantly, that it's overactivated, it's moving. That's driving the brain pattern. And so the brain, in order to keep us alive when trauma happens, the brain activates, and if it does keep us alive, it doesn't know enough to let go of that pattern necessarily. And especially if it deems the circumstance to be close to death, it really holds on to it, okay? And it doesn't let it go very easily. And so the result of that is that we don't forget it. And so it's not as easy to forgive. Now, it doesn't mean it can't be forgiven. It means it's not as easy to be forgiven. And probably to really let it go requires the brain pattern to change, somehow to change. Yeah, so how can they have a hope to overcome it? I'm not really sure. You know, I personally spent 8 years with post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury before founding the company after an assault, and I kept thinking I had let that go, but I had invasive thoughts. I had moments of fright if similar situation appeared, and I had dreams, and et cetera, et cetera. I didn't find a way, of course, but that not finding a way drove me to find the way I have, which is technology to help my brain become more symmetrical so it moves right back to, it dances again. I think sometimes there are certain things that people with trauma who don't have access to the technology can do to really help themselves. I think meditation is helpful. I know it's extremely difficult when you've been highly traumatized, if not almost impossible. But the attempt to do it at least can quiet the brain somewhat. Secondly, I think you need to be connected to nature. You could call it frequency, or you could call it naturalness if you want, but there's a certain natural state and a regulated state that nature will help us manifest. You know, being close to the ocean, being close to a stream, listening to the wind and birds, and you know, it's really can really be helpful. We recently taken a look at our database of over 50,000 people collected from around the world. And embedded in that database are questions on surveys, and those questions relate to some of the symptoms of PTSD, as well as there's a question that says, you know, have you been diagnosed with PTSD? Okay. For people that have been diagnosed, we see about a 17 to 18% of all the people that come in have been diagnosed with PTSD. But there are more than twice that many who haven't been diagnosed with PTSD who have it. And there are then many who are, you know, partially there. Part of the symptoms certainly are prominent. When we look at our data set, wow, we're looking at 60 or 70% who are affected in some kind of a life-compromising state, which is ongoing from trauma. So you could call trauma a burger, you know, I mean, it's not very cool. and we definitely need ways and means of dealing with it. Science has told us about trauma in a new way. And Dr. Porges, who writes about the polyvagal theory and how the vagus nerves carry energy into our nervous system, we see the brain as moving towards fight or flight when it can, And when it can't, it moves to a freeze response. My mother just died a few weeks ago, a month ago or so, and she was my best friend, and she was 102. So it wasn't like it was, a big surprise, if you will. I know we're all terminal in that sense, but still you don't expect it. Maybe I thought she was going to live forever. I don't know. But when she died, it was a surprise. And it so happened that I had taken my brain pattern just a few days before that because I was going to play golf. And I was trying to hone my golf game. Well, when she died, my frontal poles, my emotional center, switched to from a 2% difference in left and right to almost a 70% difference, where the 70% was responding to sadness, and that was because there was nothing I could do. That's something that you can't do anything about. Things that I wished I would have said, or I still wanted to say, or I wished I would have been there more, or there's a little guilt involved, and yada yada, right? Now, truth be known, we had a great relationship. I'd been up to see her just a couple of months before. The passing was not traumatic for her, and even though she lived in her own home, she was just taken to the hospital with some respiratory issues and then died there. So she had people with her. So everything was probably about as good as it could have been, but my brain didn't quite see it that way. And of course I was sad. And then 2 weeks later, I looked at my brain again, a little more than a week after the funeral, and now it's coming back. But certain aspects of that coming back, once it was high on the left, certain aspects are now there's a few high on the right. Okay, so there's this pendulum effect. And that's sort of what the polyvagal theory is pointing to. And that's definitely what we see in terms of data we measure in brain patterns. And as science pursues that more and understands that functionally we're driven to do things that might not be so helpful at times, but those things are simply a response, our brain moving in a different way, the pendulum coming back to some kind of a balanced state. If we understand it that way, we can accept ourselves and we can accept other people much more readily. And if we do that, we have a lot to gain.